They carried the Ark of God on a new cart and brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, were driving the new cart with the Ark of God, and Ahio went in front of the Ark. David and all the house of Israel were dancing before the Lord with all their might, with songs and lyres and harps and tambourines and castanets and cymbals. When they came to the threshing floor of Nachon, Uzzah reached out his hand to the Ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen lurched. The anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, and God struck him there, and he died there beside the Ark of God. David was angry because the Lord had burst forth with an outburst upon Uzzah. So that place is called Perez Uzzah to this day. David was afraid of the Lord that day. He said, "How can the ark of the Lord come into my care?" So David was unwilling to take the ark of the Lord into his care in the city of David. Instead, David took it to the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite. The ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite, 3 months. And the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and all his household. Yes, that is right. In this episode, we finally arrive at the most exciting and controversial part of the story of the Ark in the books of Samuel. It's murder of Uzzah. It all started with the Ark revealing itself as a conduit for the word of Yahweh to Samuel at the temple in Shiloh. Since then, the Ark has seemingly planned the deaths of the disobedient priests, Hophni and Phinehas, done a tour of the Philistine cities on the coast, battling the Philistine gods, and bringing death and disease through a series of plagues. Then, when the Philistines send it back to Israelite territory, it kills 70 men, or possibly 50,000, in the first little Israelite village where it lands. Yes, its reign of terror is quite frightening. But then, finally, things seem to settle down for a while when the ark is brought to the house of Abinadab on the hill. There the ark is finally able to stay in the same place for 20 years, and nobody dies. The ark seems to be happy with a stable life, and it doesn't kill anybody, and the entire nation is drawn to Yahweh. You may notice that as I tell the story of the ark up until this point, I may be getting a little bit punchy. Maybe I've spent too much time on this story because I think I'm beginning to anthropomorphize this inanimate piece of temple furniture that is the ark. I'm suggesting that it has will, motives, and emotions, that it gets upset and murderous when it's moved, but is a lot happier when it stays still. But no, that's kinda crazy, isn't it? That can't be the right way to look at the story. Oh, okay, I'll put that to the side. But it certainly is a bizarre story, and it's only about to get much more bizarre. For in the episode we retell today, the ark is going to be moved again, and disaster will soon follow. Before I get into the story, though, there are a few things to note that make it difficult to tell. There are chronological problems with it. The ark is said to remain in the house of Abinadab on the hill for 20 years. But when it is finally moved again in this episode, over 40 years have gone by in the story of King Saul and King David. The ark's story seems to be moving on its own timeline and giving no heed at all to how much time has elapsed in the world outside the story. Given that state of things, I'm not going to try and solve the chronology problem. I'm simply going to follow the timeline of the ark story as it is presented. There is another problem with this story that led me to having to make a choice in how to tell it. It's not entirely clear exactly who is accompanying the ark on this journey. There are apparently 3 sons of Abinadab. The first is Eleazar, who is consecrated as a priest to take care of the ark when it is first brought to his father's household. But when the ark is finally moved in this story, though the presence of the priest Eleazar would seem to be necessary, he is oddly not mentioned. Or is he? We are told that 2 other sons of Abinadab are put in charge of moving the ark, Uzzah and Ahio. But there are questions about both of these names. A few scholars have suggested that maybe Uzzah is just another form of the name Eleazar. So maybe the priest is there? And as for the other son, Ahio, well, Ahio is actually a form of the Hebrew word for brother. So it could be saying that Uzzah and his brother were accompanying the ark. Could that brother be Eleazar? Do you see what I mean? I think maybe the story is making me crazy. So, anyways, I had to make some odd choices about how to tell the story. Others might choose differently, but here is my tale. This is Retelling the Bible. Episode 8.6, Teamsters of the Lost Ark. "20 years. For 20 years, Uzzah had been stuck, living in the background. Ever since the Ark of the Covenant of Yahweh had come to his father's house on the hill, people had come from miles around just to see it and offer sacrifices in its presence. Uzzah's father created a simple structure, little more than a tent, just outside his house, in which the ark was placed. Soon there was a steady stream of worshippers and pilgrims climbing the hill to see the object of fear and wonder. They all knew the stories about it. How Yahweh had spoken to the prophet Samuel through it. How it had spread death and destruction among the Philistine cities and defeated their gods. They also spoke in hushed tones about how as many as 10,000 men had died among the Israelites in Beth Shemesh when the ark was not treated with proper respect. Uzzah always sniggered when he heard that last story. The village of Beth Shemesh was barely big enough to hold 70 people. How could thousands have died there? In any case, the steady flow of visitors to the new sanctuary brought nothing but good for Abinadab's family. They brought gifts and offerings, and of course, they wanted to perform sacrifices. And so, Abinadab had made sure that it was his eldest son, Eleazar, who was consecrated as priest to receive the sacrifices. That meant that he was able to claim the priestly portion of every offering. Eleazar was a competent priest, as far as his little brother could see. He efficiently slaughtered and butchered the animals. He safely devoted all the right portions of the meat to Yahweh, and nobody died from eating the other portions wrongly or impiously. Oh yeah, everyone loved Eleazar. He got all the honor and glory, not to mention that he made a fortune selling off the priestly portions of the meat to their wealthy neighbors. Uzzah could not help looking on his brother with an envy that bordered on hatred. Why couldn't he be consecrated too? Why couldn't he be allowed to handle and take care of the ark that Eleazar always insisted that only he could approach? It was all bogus. How was Uzzah any different from his big brother? He was just as worthy. But no, Uzzah was always given the most menial tasks. He was the one left to sweep up the blood around the altar. He had to sweep out the tent at the end of the day, once all of the gawkers had left. Eleazar got all the glory, and Uzzah got all the jobs that nobody wanted. There were many times when Uzzah wanted to just pack up and leave, strike out, and make his own way in the world. But he just couldn't let go of the hope that the day would come when his brother would mess up and die. Everyone knew the story of how the priests, Hophni and Phinehas, had been killed because of their lack of respect for the ark. Uzzah felt sure that the day would come when Eleazar did the same, and he would finally be able to slip into his linen ephod. And so he waited in the shadows for 20 years. He couldn't let go of his hope because, frankly, the ark fascinated him. Eleazar never let him approach it, but he would spend hours staring at it in the tent whenever he had the chance. It had an odd glow about it, reflected from the lamps that were kept burning late into the night. It was a menacing presence. There was no denying that. But it drew him nonetheless. He rarely stopped thinking about it. As time went by, he became more and more obsessed with it. It haunted his dreams. He was having trouble sleeping. He started sneaking into his brother's larder, stealing his priestly portions and gorging himself in secret feasts. He grew fat and slovenly, as the food was the only thing that seemed to fill the void that he felt inside. But Eleazar never messed up, and so he waited for 20 years. One morning, the household on the hill awoke to find itself surrounded by a large collection of armed men. They were warriors of a chieftain named David, who had recently conquered a Jebusite city and was making it the center of his administration. David was a devotee of the god Yahweh, and so he had decided that the perfect thing that would help him to establish his new capital was the Ark of the Covenant. He had come to demand that it be handed over to him. David couched the request in very friendly and respectful terms, but the mere presence of his large body of troops certainly made it clear that Abinadab and his family could hardly say no. The soldiers had brought a cart and a team of oxen with them. The tent structure that housed the ark was quickly dismantled and stored upon the cart. But when it came time to load the ark itself, the soldiers hesitated. They too had heard the stories of its mystical powers, and they hesitated to handle it themselves. Eleazar saw their uncertainty and quickly stepped forward. He told them that they would indeed be very wise to leave the care of the ark to someone who knew what he was doing. He promised to put on his linen ephod, and as an ordained priest, he would make sure that the ark was properly cared for. Eleazar understood that his lucrative work as a priest in his father's house had now been terminated. But he held out the hope that perhaps this David might be willing to give him a gig in his new city. David agreed that Eleazar could take charge of the transport of the ark, but he certainly was not in the market for a new high priest. He already had 2 of them, and their constant bickering and competition had already caused him his share of headaches. Of course, he didn't say any of that to Eleazar, who eagerly went off to put on his ephod. When it came time to actually load the ark onto the cart, it wasn't as if Eleazar was going to do the heavy lifting. He quickly fell into his habit of ordering Uzzah about while he strained to get the ark into position. It felt odd for Uzzah to finally get his hands on the ark after all this time, even as it would likely be his last chance to ever interact with it. When he touched it, after all this time looking at it from a distance, it felt strange. Something like an electric current flowed through him, but he told himself that it was just his imagination. When everything was finally in place, David and the soldiers were impatient to get going, and so Eleazar moved to stand in front of the team. He looked expectantly at Uzzah until his little brother took the goad and jammed it into the rear of the closest ox harder than he really needed to. The team lurched into motion. It was a long day. A team of oxen tops out at maybe 3 kilometers an hour. But what they lack in speed, they certainly make up in endurance. They just keep going and going and going. And so Uzzah just kept trudging and trudging and trudging alongside them as the countryside slowly passed by. The early clouds soon cleared, and the sun started to beat down on them. And before long, Uzzah, who had not really exerted himself for some time, was sweating profusely. Uzzah had nothing to do other than to administer a quick jab to the beasts whenever their glacial pace seemed to be flagging. His mind was left free to roam. He watched as David and his attendants danced in front of the team, whirling about with wild abandon, accompanied by lyres, harps, tambourines, castanets, and cymbals, the noise of which was giving him a headache. And then, between the dancers and the oxen strode Eleazar, his white robes slowly being turned brown by the dusty road, desperately attempting to look dignified and important in the midst of all the chaos. Uzzah stared at him as his mind seethed. He could only think of how much he hated his brother. Sibling rivalry, especially the rivalry between first and second brothers, was a fine old tradition among the Israelite people. Uzzah was in good company as he wished for his brother to be struck down. By the time they came to the farm that belonged to a man named Nachon, Uzzah was feeling quite out of breath. Even the slow pace of the oxen was starting to feel a bit excessive to him. Had it been up to him, he certainly would have called for a rest and a chance to sit down. But as he looked forward at the still dancing David, although the pace of the dancing had slowed somewhat, and the stern soldiers who marched alongside, he knew that he was in no position to tell anyone that it was time for a break. Nachon's threshing floor was located on the flat top of a small hill. The place was perfectly positioned so that when the farmer winnowed his grain, he could catch the wind, and it would come and blow the chaff away. The ox team continued on up the slope with barely any variation in their steady speed. Uzzah, for his part, felt as if he were climbing a mountain. Spots began to dance before his eyes, and he felt an ache in his neck and shoulders. As they came to the top of the hill, and the way flattened out again, Uzzah attempted to take a few deep breaths, but the pain in his chest made it difficult. Then, as the oxen came to the far edge of the floor and began to descend again, something happened. The slope going down was much steeper than the climb had been, and the lead animal stumbled at the first step, and that threw the whole team off. The cart suddenly lurched to the side, and as Uzzah looked up in surprise, the load upon the cart was shifting towards him. He cried out and reached out his hand, as it looked to him as if the ark had launched itself towards him with murderous intent. Then he cried out in sharp pain and felt darkness, and then finally some peace fall over him. A sudden and unexplained death is a very troubling and frightening thing. Today, with our vast knowledge of medical and bodily processes, deaths often have a reasonable explanation. When they don't, we insist on carrying out investigations and autopsies to identify the cause. But such understandings and investigations were largely unavailable to ancient people, and so unexplained death was a not infrequent part of life. But they were no less troubled by death, and no less insistent on finding an explanation. When Uzzah suddenly collapsed to the ground, everyone swarmed around him so quickly that, had he been breathing, it would have been smothering. As it was, it took only minutes to determine that the life had indeed gone out of him. And the speculation as to what had killed him began almost immediately. The obvious explanation, everyone agreed, had to be that some god had killed him. It was, after all, a common MO when you're dealing with divine beings. And, since they were all engaged in an activity that concerned Yahweh, it only made sense that he was the one to blame. But, as the people continued to talk about this, panic began to spread. Yahweh was a powerful God, and if he was angry, he might still have more smiting to do. Uzzah might just be the start, and Yahweh might be recharging in order to destroy them all. Fear and panic can spread very quickly in such circumstances. Even David's toughest warriors were looking a little pale and starting to scan for escape routes. David had already shown himself to have many flaws at this point in his life. He would certainly display many more in years to come. But one thing had always served him well, and that was the fact that he had a very quick mind. He sized up the situation immediately and came up with a plan to defuse the panic. "Hold, men of Israel, hold!" he cried. "I know that you have all seen what has happened here. This teamster, what was his name?" Eleazar spoke up. "He was my brother, Uzzah." The priest was surprised at himself to hear the catch in his throat and to feel a few tears rolling down his cheeks. Uzzah might not have been much in his eyes, but he was family. David took up the name. "Uzzah! Uzzah!" he cried. You all know what happened to him here. He reached out his hand towards the Ark of Yahweh and touched it. Because he treated the Ark with such impiety, Yahweh has burst out against him. But now Yahweh's anger has been satisfied, and you need not fear further retribution. And then, to cement his interpretation of the event in everyone's mind, David declared that henceforth this place would be known by the name Perez Uzzah, in commemoration of how Yahweh had burst out against Uzzah, and only him. Thus did David manage to quell the fear that was building among his people. And so persuasively had he spoken that no one even bothered to mention that they hadn't seen the man actually touch the ark. So, David had effectively managed to calm things down, but he still had a problem to deal with. On the one hand, he realized that what had happened here made the ark even more valuable to him. The word of this incident would spread far and wide, and, as frightening as it might be, it would only enhance the mystique around the ark. Whoever was able to control the ark would command extraordinary power. And David wanted that power. But, on the other hand, he also understood that they really could not continue their journey from here. The people were all teetering so close to panic that if any small thing went wrong, be it another slight misstep by the oxen or even a bad omen seen in the flight of birds, the fragile order that he had reestablished could fall apart in a moment. He had to pause this journey. But David wasn't willing to entrust the ark to any of the Israelite elite. Given the power that everyone now recognized that the ark had, an Israelite devotee of Yahweh could very well use it to create his own power base that might jeopardize David's still fragile hold on his position. David's quick mind cast about for some other possibility. He didn't like to talk about it too much, and his descendants would enjoy talking about it even less. But David had forged much of his early success by working closely with the Philistines. They were the ones who had helped protect him when he was rebelling against Saul, and they had provided for him a good base of operations for the raiding and protection racketeering that had been the foundation of his fortune. He had since left behind such embarrassing beginnings as he attempted to establish himself as a noble Israelite and a man after God's own heart among his people. But he had brought a few Philistines along with him for the ride. They were fantastic warriors and formed the core of his personal bodyguard. They were men from the Philistine city of Gath, known as Gittites. And, like any good chieftain, when his fighters performed brilliantly in battle, David was always quick to reward them. One of his Gittite warriors was a man named Obed-Edom. and David had recently gifted Obed-Edom with a small estate not far from this very spot. As soon as he remembered this fact, a plan began to form in David's mind. The ox team was diverted to the farm of Obed-Edom. When they arrived, David went in and spoke directly to the member of his bodyguard. He informed him that he was to keep the ark safe here, but that he was not to display it, no matter how many pilgrims came. Instead, he was to have every member of his household spread the word that the house was enjoying extraordinary blessing from Yahweh during its residence. If Obed-Edom would only do that, David would make sure that it would be no lie, for he personally would send many blessings to the household. And then, after a few months, David would return, and the people would be happy to see the ark brought to David's new city. Many people struggle with the story of Uzzah. The notion that God might have struck this Israelite man down for something that seems to be little more than making a gesture that was intended to protect the ark from falling is troubling. But I think it's important to remember that the death may have been real, but the explanation or the motivation for the death was a matter of interpretation. Oh yes, I know. It says in the text that God struck him down. But how exactly did the people in the crowd know that? There is no report of a heavenly announcement. The people on the ground had to interpret what they had seen according to their own understanding. The fact of the matter is that people die suddenly, and for seemingly unexplained reasons. It has always happened, and it always will. Such deaths are always shocking and disturbing. And when they happen, people will demand an explanation. When none is forthcoming by means of science or investigation, people do not simply shrug their shoulders and say, "Oh, well, I guess we'll never know." Instead, they grasp any other explanation they can find, and a divine explanation is often the default. But you say, isn't the Bible an inspired text? Isn't this explanation therefore provided to us by God? Absolutely. This is an inspired explanation. And if David came up with it, it was absolutely brilliant. It served to enhance the mystique of the ark, turning it into an object of even greater power that David could use to establish his kingdom. And if that was what God wanted to happen, then sure, I'll say that this explanation was inspired by God. What? Did you think that God could only inspire texts that conveyed the literal truth? Who are you to tell God what kind of text God may inspire? That is it for this episode of Retelling the Bible. Please subscribe so you can get the next episode in a couple of weeks. A special Easter episode, of course. The theme music for the podcast is Uzzah, and the mood music for this episode was Magic Escape Room. The music is by Kevin MacLeod, licensed under the Creative Commons, and can be found at incompetech.com. You can contact me on twitter.com at retellingbible and on the Facebook page Retelling the Bible. Show notes for this episode have been posted at retellingthebible.wordpress.com. Thanks again to my awesome Patreon supporters, Anton, Ruth, Matt, Mitch Ruth, Donna, Amma, Johnny B, Dave, Karen, Gertin, Pinkaboo. Your support means so much to me. Go to patreon.com/retellingthebible to support this podcast. This is Retelling the Bible, and I have been your storyteller, W. Scott McCandless.